So, who are actually the most privileged groups of people in society? I think it's actually a very interesting question and a valid one. Now, most of my audience are right wingers, and I identify more as right than left. So, I definitely reject the kind of, I guess you could say, like left, liberal, whatever view of privilege, which has white, male, heterosexual, Christian, whatever people as being the most privileged. The reason is, like, even if you could argue that historically they were the most privileged, like, let's say in the 19th century or in the early 20th century, there has been so much effort to turn the tables on people in these groups that today I don't think you can call them the most privileged anymore. Because I think if you're going into the workforce today, being a white male is objectively a negative. And that's from personal observation. That's what I've seen. Like the only white men who seem to actually have privilege in the workforce, and when I'm talking white men, I mean white Goyish men. The only white Goyish men who seem to have any degree of privilege in the workforce, maybe a little bit if you're LGBT, but also more so if you're old. That's the thing, because they've been kind of grandfathered in, where it's like a lot of these boomers and Gen Xers still do have some privilege. But if you're a millennial or Gen Z, I would say being a white male is more detrimental than anything, especially younger millennials and Gen Z. Like, I think there's a bit of a gray area. Like, if you're born between, I don't know, let's say 1975 and 1985, there's a little bit of a gray area there where some people in that group may have just slightly gone into the good old boys club, like kind of at the last minute. Like kind of like Tony Soprano says in the very first episode, you know, I came into this thing kind of late past its glory days, but still in it. But yeah, regardless, my point is, yeah, I completely reject this idea of privilege being based on who was the most privileged 100 years ago or whatever. I think the more valid question is like who's actually more privileged today, in terms of being able to succeed in the workforce more easily. In terms of the amount of money they're making. And sure, there's inherited wealth. That's a factor too. You could say some whites are privileged in terms of inherited wealth, even if they're shit on in the workplace. But I would argue for many people, that's not as much of a thing anymore either, for millennials and Gen Z, because a lot of boomers are hoarding that wealth. But again, that can vary from person to person. You know, of the people I've known, there's varying personal experiences that people have had in that regard. But yeah, without further ado, I'm going to talk about who I think are actually the most privileged groups of people today in Western society. Like, I'm looking at it predominantly from a North American perspective, but also Western culture, like Western society in a broader sense. And I'm going to divide them into two different groups. So the first is identity politics groups, and the second is other types of people, but that aren't necessarily identity politics related groups. So I'm going to go from the ones like the different tiers of who are the most privileged. So yeah. And looking at it holistically, I do think you have to look at it in terms of privilege in the sense of like people who receive, like there are some groups that receive privilege in the sense that they benefit from affirmative action, they benefit from DEI, but on the other hand, they might suffer from the fact that yes, they do tend to be disproportionately poor, or they do get negative attention from police, and they do tend to grow up in ghettos. So for instance, like blacks and Native Americans would fall into that category, those categories. So that's why I'm not putting them on this list, because I'm really looking at who's the most privileged here, like who's actually at the top of the list. So yeah, the ones who are near the top of the list, this is identity politics groups. Okay, so the ones who are near the top of the list but not quite at the top of the list, I would put LGBs, East Asians, South Asians, Middle Easterners / North Africans, and women as a whole. Now, I said LGBs because I think the thing is with being transgendered is like I do think there's a significant number of people, even if they won't admit it, who still find it weird. And frankly, that group of people has such a severe ratio of mental illness and self termination that, like, I don't know if I can realistically call them the most privileged or even one of the most privileged, even if they are a group that is very much pandered to and very much focused on by the modern left. So I'm not going to put them near on this list like as being high ranking, but I will put LGBs because I think L's, G's, and B's are suffer from those issues to a lower extent than the T's do. I think they're more widely accepted, and the mental health issues they suffer from, on average, are less severe. So I'm going to put, yeah, as I said, LGBs, East Asians, South Asians, Middle Easterners, and North Africans, and women. I'm going to explain why. Okay, so for LGBs, it's because, as I said, there's less of a negative, like, there's still some stigma with the transgenders, even if people won't admit it, because the fact is a lot of people are actually really disturbed or discomforted by them. Like, it's just still a thing, even if people won't admit it. I think the majority of people do feel that way. It's just that they won't openly admit it because they don't want to be seen as bigoted. I would say the majority of people probably do admit it in really conservative places. Like, I'd imagine in like Oklahoma or Kansas, the majority of people probably would openly admit to that. Whereas with LGBs, I think there's more acceptance, and I think they're also objectively succeeding more, like in terms of like average income, in terms of how they're doing in the workforce. And I do notice there is some amount of nepotism within the LGBT community, although not as much as some of the other groups I'm going to get to. So yeah, I'm going to put them, again, like in the second tier of highest levels of privilege, but not right at the top. Now, the next three groups I'm going to kind of lump together because they're very similar in many ways. East Asians, South Asians, and Middle Easterners and North Africans. So essentially, in the 19th century definition of the word, Oriental or Eastern civilization, like this idea of like the non-Western world, but not Sub-Saharan Africa and not really mestizos either. Because I would say these groups, the thing that sets these groups aside, at least in a North American context, is they do tend to be more white collar, and they tend to be perceived as like not high crime groups. Like, I don't think they have the same stigma from the police as like maybe blacks or Native Americans do in some contexts. So they kind of get the best of both worlds because they tend to be high achieving. They tend to be perceived as not being like sketchy or criminal. Like, there's not the same stigma on them. And again, I'm not trying to say this stigma is unjustified. I'm just saying the stigma does exist. Like, there is some perception still of blacks and Native Americans and mestizos as being more criminally oriented demographics. And like, whether it's fair or not fair is a separate question. But the point is there is still more of that perception. Now with East Asians, there's definitely not that perception. With South Asians, like Indian subcontinental people, I would say generally not. Although there's a little bit of a perception of the men being kind of perverts, which is not a baseless perception. It not entirely baseless. And there is the fact, okay, sometimes with South Asians, they could be mistaken for other races. Like, they could be mistaken for mestizos, perhaps. But generally speaking, I would say no, like, there's not that much negative association with them in that regard. With Middle Easterners and North Africans, that's a very interesting thing. It really varies depending on which continent you're on. Because I find in Canada and the United States, there's not the perception of them as having high crime rates, which is just accurate. Like, they don't have crime rates that are terribly high. But then if you go to Europe, on the other hand, they are more associated with that, and they do have higher crime rates there. And they also tend, I think, to be much poorer on average in Europe. So again, I would say this is more true in a North American context for Middle Easterners and North Africans specifically. In Europe, they're a bit more ghettoized and a bit poorer on average, so I wouldn't put them quite as high. But in a North American context, yes, I would include Middle Easterners and North Africans. I'm not sure about Australia and New Zealand, to be honest. I know they had like riots between Lebanese people and whites there, but I don't know what the overall socioeconomic situation of Middle Eastern slash North African people is there, so I can't really explain. Also, in terms of like Middle Eastern Christians, they'd actually, I'd say, be less privileged because you might get lower DEI points for hiring them. Like I feel like Middle Eastern Christians are in this gray area where they're not considered white, but they're not necessarily really considered people of color either. They're in kind of a very gray area. So I'd imagine that like they don't get as much benefits from the whole DEI affirmative action thing, but I could be wrong. Maybe they get some benefits from it. Now East Asians actually do get negative affirmative action when it comes to universities in the United States. But in a workplace context, I don't think so. Not really. I think they actually do get, at least especially in Canada, I think East Asians do benefit from affirmative action and DEI and whatever. Um, so yeah, like they get the best of both worlds, like East Asians, South Asians, and at least in North America, Middle Easterners and North Africans, where it's like they're not overly poor, they're not perceived as being like sketchy or whatever, but they do benefit from affirmative action and DEI for the most part. So they kind of get the best of both worlds. And that's one thing actually in South Africa, even. Like a lot of people have observed that like Indians in South Africa are some of the biggest beneficiaries from some of the affirmative action policies that they've implemented since the fall of the apartheid regime in 1994. So yeah, it's a recurring pattern throughout the world where it's like I feel like these particular groups are the ones who really clean up, and that's what I've observed in my own personal life too. Like in the workplace, East Asians, South Asians, and Middle Easterners slash North Africans, they tend to be the ones that are really gaining a lot of clout and a lot of power in the white collar business world. So yeah, I would put these groups actually pretty high. Now, I also included at this level women. Women as a whole, including white women, have been tremendous beneficiaries of affirmative action and DEI. In my own personal experience in the workplace, like white women are everywhere and non-white women also, especially like the aforementioned groups like East Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern, and North African women. Women outnumber men at almost every white collar workplace I've worked at, and also in academia at the universities and colleges I've been to. Like, it's not even close. It's not even close. Women are dominating things these days. There's also the hashtag believe all women. There's this idea that like you're more credible because you're a woman. There's the idea that like men are inherently viewed with more suspicion, and it's proven that men get worse sentences for the same crimes compared to women on average. Admittedly, men do commit crime more than women on average, but still, nonetheless, it does happen. Except shoplifting, women shoplift, I think, more than men. So that's, I think, the one crime women do commit more per capita. But yeah, overall, though, I think being a woman is playing life on easy mode more than being a man. I think the only thing with being a woman is like, yeah, in some US states, it's like these days, yes, they can be in a situation where if they're pregnant, they don't have the option of abortion anymore. But again, like how hard is it for them to just go to another state and have an abortion? I don't know. Also, there is the fact that yes, women are more likely to be sexually harassed or sexually assaulted or whatever in public places. The flip side, though, is if you're a man, you're way, way more likely to be accused of these things, whether truthfully or falsely. So that's the flip side of that. Also, if you're a man, if you go to prison, you are fucked. Like your chance of being sexually violated there is extremely high. So that's the one caveat with men. It's like, yeah, you're less likely to be sexually violated unless you go to prison, in which case, good luck. And again, I'm talking in a North American context there. I understand that like not everywhere in the Western world has these problems to the extent North America does. US is worse than Canada for this sort of thing in prison, but it still does happen in Canada, I believe, more than other Western countries. As always, we tend to be between the US and Western Europe in most statistics, in this middle ground. in the middle of the North Atlantic, kind of the middle ground where the Titanic sank. That's where Canadians occupy. But yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. That is one thing that sucks about being a woman, like that. You're more likely to be harassed or assaulted in public places. Like I'll say myself, there's plenty of places I've been alone where as a guy, I feel more safe than if I was a woman. But the flip side of that is also that, well, there's so many disadvantages to being a man. Plus, if you're a woman who's like decently attractive and you're not and doesn't have a totally shitty personality, then guess what? You'll probably have a good choice of decent men who you can have as your boyfriend or husband who can go to these places with you. Although again, yeah, that does create issues if you're like kind of an introvert and you prefer going places alone. So fair enough. Like I will say being a woman can be a disadvantage in that regard, but I think in other contexts, like especially in a workplace context, I think being a man is a much bigger disadvantage. And definitely in a legal context when dealing with police or court systems. And many other, an academic context also. Like, frankly, even in school, like, the boys always got in more trouble for girls for, like, doing the exact same thing. It's not even close. So, yeah, those are the second level of privilege, the groups that I have at the second level. The top level I have, the most privileged identity politics related group by far, it's not even close, is Jews. And when Argent did his annual survey and asked people about the privilege question, they got by far the highest rankings in this survey also. I don't think it's even close. I think they are by far the most privileged group. Every time they bitch and complain about anything, it's literally another Shoah. And even look at like the recent reaction to the genocide going on in Gaza right now, how they've managed to portray themselves as the victims. Like, oh, there's backlash, therefore we're the main victims here. And a lot of people believe it. A lot of people on the left and the right believe this narrative where it's like, oh, the real victims are Jews who receive backlash. And a lot of the mass media has been promoting this narrative. And not just the mass media, I've seen it on fucking Reddit, on various places online, people actually unironically believing this narrative. Yes, like they got some minor backlash for an all-out genocide, and they're the real victims. And all genocide that is currently ongoing, not something that happened in the past, but something that is currently ongoing, and that many of their organizations are actively complicit in. Like, there's so many links between, your average synagogue and Israel. It's not even like, they don't even try to hide it. Like, they put signs everywhere, like, about stand for Israel, united for Israel, blah, blah, blah. Like, you can't really decouple Jews from Israel. I'm sorry, you can't. I mean, there's individual Jews who I don't think should be held responsible if they genuinely oppose this shit. And I don't think it's fair to just, like, I'm not condoning any kind of violence or harassment. I'm just saying that them portraying themselves as the real victims here is fucking bullshit. So yeah, I mean, I think they are the most privileged group. When you look at like Ivy League admissions, average income, GDP per capita, overrepresentation in academia, mass media, banking, just among the rich in general, the sheer number of billionaires, it's not even close. And the disproportionate level of influence in politics, media, online, like every fucking okay, not every aspect of society. I will say that there are some aspects of society where their influence is more disproportionate than others, but I would argue where their influence is the most disproportionate are the things that truly matter the most. Like, I would say academia, media, politics, like that's like, those are like, and banking. Like, I think those are some of the most important, like Wall Street, finance, banking. Like, I think those are some of the most important, like, institutions in society. And that have the most true power. It's like, okay, do they like dominate literally every industry? No. Like if you look at like, say for instance, like the automobile industry or the fossil fuels industry or whatever, maybe they don't dominate those, or like a lot of like blue collar engineering stuff or whatever. Maybe they don't dominate every single industry, but I think they do dominate a lot of the most important and powerful ones. So yeah, I'm putting them as number one most privileged group, and it's not even fucking close. Okay, it is not even fucking close. It is by such a margin that all the other groups are so far below them that they can't even look up and see their feet. It's not even close. They are the most privileged group, bar none, by a huge margin. And I mean, if we're going into more specifics, like I could argue that like even among the second tier most privileged identity politics groups, some are more privileged than others. Like I do think in Canada, Sikhs have a lot of disproportionate power and influence on politics, and I might put them as second highest after Jews, but I don't think it's even close. Same with Mormons in the United States. Maybe they do seem to have a lot of disproportionate political influence in the United States also. And media. Like now with like Angel Studios, it's like they're starting to create their own Hollywood. So yeah, I mean, maybe they are second place, like Sikhs in Canada and Mormons in the United States, but I still think it's not even close. I'm not sure if there's anyone like that in Europe who I'd put as a clear second place like that. Like it definitely would not be the gypsies, because they live in very poor conditions. Like I'd put them in the same categories with like blacks and Native Americans, basically, as groups that like they benefit from affirmative action, but they also generally live in pretty poor conditions and do have some degree of negative stigma associated with them as being connected with criminality in many people's minds. To what degree, justifiably or unjustifiably, again, that's another question. It's another topic, but yeah. Yeah, I don't know who in Europe would be like a second place like that. I don't think there really is anyone. But yeah, weirdly, like Sikhs in Canada and Mormons in the US, I think follow some of the same patterns as Jews, but I don't think they're in the same ballpark. Not yet anyway, but who knows? Give the Mormons a few centuries and we'll see what they're up to by that point. Maybe Angel Studios will rival Hollywood. Who knows? It remains to be seen. I mean, Mormons are kind of becoming their own ethnic group, and they do have a lot of similarities to Jews in some ways. And then Sikhs, I mean, well, they're also a monotheistic, ethnically based religion that seems to be very nepotistic and has a strong degree of in-group preference. And they do seem to be doing well for themselves in Canada, especially. So yeah, who knows? Maybe these groups could out-merchant the merchants one day. It remains to be seen. But as of yet, they're not even close. And again, I'm not sure if Sikhs have the same disproportionate power in any other country. In the UK, Australia, New Zealand, I don't know. It'd be interesting if somebody from those countries could comment on that, because I think that's a very interesting question. But here in Canada, like for instance, they got Justin Trudeau to flat out ruin our relationship with the government of India because he's protecting some kind of, it was a Sikh separatists who was assassinated in Canada, and they blame the Indian government for this. And it's like, okay, so we're ruining our relationship with the government of India on behalf of some Sikh separatist group? Why? This is stupid. And it's like, and the Sikhs are very disproportionately represented in Canadian politics. Like if you look at members of parliament, like Jagmeet Singh, he's the leader of the NDP. Yeah, Sikhs are very overrepresented in politics. So yeah, that is a thing. That is a thing. So I will say the Jews are not unique in that regard, because I am noticing similar patterns from Mormons, from Sikhs, even in Latin America, from Lebanese to some extent. Like I think Lebanese Christians in Latin America. But I just don't think any of them are quite in the same ballpark in terms of like the disproportionate level of influence over every aspect of society, like media, academia, banking, government. They might cover like 1 out of 4, but not all 4. But like for instance, Sikhs would be like probably more politics, but not so much media, academia, or banking. Mormons would be, I guess, politics and increasingly media a bit, but I don't think academia or banking quite yet. Lebanese in Latin America, I think would be more like, yeah, finance, like banking and stuff. They like, but maybe media. I'm not sure about academia and whatever. And again, like it's also a question: do they have an agenda? That's another thing because Jews very much like to promote certain ethnic-based agendas, like certain narratives. Whereas, do the Lebanese do this in Latin America? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I don't. I've not as far as I know. They seem to just be disproportionately wealthy and powerful, but I don't think they necessarily have any kind of agenda they seem to be aggressively promoting. That's kind of the same as, again, like Chinese in Southeast Asia. Like, aside from the agenda of like boosting China's influence in the region, but I mean, they don't seem to have as much of like a political agenda, whereas Jews here have always been aggressively promoting like social liberalism, like feminism, multiculturalism, LGBT politics, although they've been on both sides of kind of like economics. Like they promote capitalism. They have promoted capitalism and communism quite a bit. So I guess they hedge their bets in that regard to some extent. Sort of like the Zionism versus Bolshevism thing. But again, I think there's plenty of overlap in terms of supporting Israel versus supporting left liberal politics. But yeah, so those are, I think, the most privileged groups in terms of identity politics groups. Now, in terms of groups that aren't identity politics groups, like that aren't like racial or religious or ethnic or gender or sexuality, I think there's a few groups that actually do have some disproportionate privilege, and I want to talk about them. The lowest on this group and barely makes the list anymore is tourists, because I think there's been a lot of backlash against tourists lately. But nonetheless, they do have some privilege in the sense that like tourists do get away with like emitting a shitload of carbon and having a negative impact on the environment and overtaking certain places with like Airbnbs and stuff like that and completely flooding certain places. But nonetheless, I see a lot of backlash against tourists lately, and I also feel that like a lot of this could change in the future. So I don't think tourists are near the top of this list. Now I could mention immigrants, but I think a lot of that has been already covered by the aforementioned groups. But I will say immigrants as a whole do have a certain privilege insofar as like they seem to be immune from criticism, where it's like, oh, if you criticize immigrants, it's very politically incorrect. You can't say that. Whereas like in Europe, they will literally say in the graffiti you'll see around Southern Europe, like tourists go home, refugees welcome. And again, refugees is kind of a term for all immigrants if you're like, unless you're white, basically. Like a lot of so-called refugees are basically economic migrants. And yeah, I mean, immigrants do have a certain privilege in terms of being allowed to just sort of usurp the culture of their host country and impose their own culture on it, and to not have to integrate, to not have to abide by cultural norms. They get a certain amount of leeway in that. So yeah, I'd say they are on this list. SUV and pickup truck drivers definitely get away with murder. They get away with driving these dangerous, vehicles that are inherently dangerous toward pedestrians that have caused pedestrian deaths to increase quite a bit. Vehicles that are dangerous to drivers in smaller vehicles, that use more gasoline, that emit more carbon, that take up more space. And frankly, they are not taxed nearly as much as they should be for driving these fucking behemoths. And they also don't get as much shit as tourists do. Like tourists, this is why I put tourists lower, because tourists are getting a lot of shit lately for their carbon emissions, but I find SUV and pickup truck drivers get less shit for it than they did 20 years ago. If anything, like in the 90s and the 2000s, it was more fashionable to mock them, like the Canyonero, the whole Canyonero skit in The Simpsons, like with the Canyonero ad and that whole episode. But lately, no, they've become so normalized. Like the majority of people seem to drive either a pickup truck or an SUV, and they get no shit for it. Not even from environmentalists, like hardly any. So yeah, I'm gonna put them pretty high on the list. Suburbanites, for similar reasons to SUV and pickup truck drivers, and there's a lot of overlap between these two groups. But yeah, in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of the amount of land that is destroyed on their behalf, like forests and natural areas, in terms of the sheer costs of the infrastructure to support suburbia and how other communities bear those costs. Strong Towns talks about this quite extensively. I'd recommend reading the book Strong Towns for more information on this. It really lays this out in a lot of detail, why suburbia just economically drains other regions and feeds off them and parasites off them. Also, suburbanites get away with NIMBYism quite a bit, and which results in pretty much a lot of the crime gets just pushed onto the inner cities because the suburbanites reject any kind of low income housing or anything that like helps with like any kind of like facilities for the homeless or for drug addicts or anything like that. They push all the shit, all the undesirables onto the inner cities, which basically alleviates the suburbs of the burden for having to deal with these people. But yet many suburbanites still vote for policies like all these woke policies. It's just they don't want it in their own backyard. It's like, oh, they want the methadone center or whatever, or the safe injection. No, not methadone. Sorry, I didn't mean that. I meant the safe injection sites where people can do illegal drugs and get away with it, and where it's basically facilitated by the government. They a lot of suburbanites support this shit. It's just they don't want it in their own backyard. They just want to dump it all on the inner cities. Same as how they feel with immigration. They're fine with importing and support importing tons of poor people, low-income people from other countries as menial labor. They just don't want these people to live in their own neighborhoods. But they're fine with benefiting off this labor if it makes them richer. So yeah, suburbanites as a whole, I'm putting very high on this list. I actually think they're more privileged than rich people in urban areas because rich people in the inner cities have to deal with the crime more so than suburbanites do. Definitely more so than rich suburbanites. I'd say more so even than middle-class suburbanites. The only suburbanites who have to deal with this shit really are the ones in like lower middle class or like lower class suburbs, like inner ring suburbs. So when I talk about suburbanites, I'm really talking more like exurbs and like wealthier suburbs and stuff like that. I'm not necessarily talking about like the poor suburbs or the lower income suburbs or the inner ring suburbs. But I do think like a certain type of suburbanite is extremely privileged because they get to insulate themselves basically from all of society's crap, and they don't really get much criticism for it. And yet they don't pay more taxes. That's another thing. They are allowed to insulate themselves from all the undesirables, but yet they don't have to pay any higher taxes than, say, people of the same income level who live in the inner city and who do have to deal with these problems. So yeah, suburbanites are pretty high on the list. But getting even higher, attractive people, like people who are physically attractive. Like, yes, the halo effect is a thing. If you look more physically attractive, you will, on average, have an easier time in life. The only negative is if you're a woman, you probably will get harassed more, like sexually, but the flip side is there's so many opportunities that it opens for you in terms of like career advancement, social advancement, who you can date, like even again, how law enforcement treats you. Like being attractive is overall a huge net benefit, and it's a big thing. The only thing that stops this from being right at the top of the list is that attractiveness does have an expiry date. So it's like by the time you're older, it won't matter as much because you won't be as attractive as when you were younger. Although that varies from some people. Like some people are able to stay attractive remarkably long, like into their 40s and 50s, whereas other people not so much. So it can really vary. But yes, it does have an expiry date. So that prevents it from being the very top of the list. Very top of the list for non-identity politics factors is simply just being rich. Especially if you're super rich. Being rich in and of itself is a huge privilege, and the rich can be very nepotistic in their own circles, promoting their own people based on like who you know, based on like who your friends are, what parties you go to, what clubs you attend, like golf clubs or social clubs or what have you. Just they do have a certain amount of like in-group nepotism, like the upper class as a whole. So yeah, I would say just being rich, being upper class is probably the biggest non-identity politics uh, type of privilege. And I would say that versus being Jewish, I mean, they're kind of there's a lot of overlap there, but yeah, I would say they're on a similar level for sure. Um, so yeah, those would be I would say the people who overall have the most privilege in society.